Great. Well, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is James Fisk. I'm CEO of the BCIS, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's BCIS webinar. It's a cold day, so hopefully the topic will warm us up. I'm not sure about that, but we'll see. For those who aren't aware, BCIS is the Building Cost Information Service. It's been around quite a few years, providing sort of essential cost, life cycle cost, and soon to be carbon data for estimating and benchmarking. And that data is available at every single stage of a project when you need it to sort of make design sort of or specification decisions. This webinar is not about sort of selling BCIS by any means, but if anybody wants more information, David, if you can flick to the next slide for me. I believe our web address is listed there, so bcis.co.uk for anybody who wants more information and more insights. There's lots of insights being posted on bcis.co.uk on a regular basis. So why are we here today? Well, needless to say, we're living in very strange times. High inflation, recession, energy price rises, wars, climate change, pandemics, and even a World Cup in the winter, which is the first one I've ever been aware of, and a World Cup in the middle of a desert as well, which is quite strange. But today's session is really designed to help you hear about our views, BCIS's views, on what those things mean for the outlook and price movements in the construction sector. Not really about the World Cup, though, just to be clear. It's probably about the other things more than it is the World Cup. Before I talk about today's agenda, we're going to trial, we're trialing a new technology today, so it'll be great to hear from you at the end of this session in terms of whether that technology's worked. But we're also going to try a simple poll. So David, if you can move over to the next screen. The top right of this screen sort of shows you where you can find the poll. That little button that's highlighted in red. And the question we're asking you today is, which proposed bill that's currently going through Parliament do you think will have the greatest impact on the construction sector? And the idea is that obviously we'll complete, many of you can complete this poll as possible, and we'll talk about some of the results of this later on in today's sort of Q&A session. So the options that we have is the Carbon Emissions Buildings Bill, which will obviously move us into whole life carbon emission reporting for buildings and setting limits. The Green Belt Protection Bill, a bill to establish a national register of green belt land in England. Healthy Homes Bill, a bill to make provision for the delivery of healthy homes and neighbourhoods, so sort of common principles of what a healthy home is. Housing standards for the refugees and asylum seekers, and that's about minimum standards for accommodation for refugees and asylum seekers. And last but not least, the Minimum Energy Performance of Buildings Bill, which is about to increase the energy performance of buildings. So they are just a snippet of some of the bills that are currently going through Parliament. And we would like your views on which one of those do you think is going to have the greatest impact on the construction sector. David, if you can move on to the next slide for me. Thank you. So today we'll be hearing from our very own David Crosswaite, who you can see on screen, who heads up our BCIS consultancy service. David will be highlighting the current sort of economic challenges and the BCIS view of what is happening with costs and prices. Following David's shortish presentation, I think it's about sort of 10 sort of 15 minutes, I will then be asking your questions to a panel of experts from the BCIS. So please feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar using the chat box. And again, the graphic on this particular slide just shows you how you can access that chat box. Ideally, questions not connected to weather predictions or World Cup, because we're not too good at that, I don't think, but we'll have a go by all means. I'll get through as many of the questions that you post as we possibly can in the time that permits. For those that we don't get around to today, the idea is that we're going to answer those on the BCIS LinkedIn group. And again, on the slide, you should be able to see the LinkedIn BCIS group link. So any extra questions, we'll be posting on those and sort of answering and interacting with you through that group. This session will be recorded and made available also on BCIS. So in case you encounter any sort of technology problems, don't worry, there will be a chance of watching this and interacting with the speakers through LinkedIn, as we were talking about after the event. When leaving today's session, you're going to be prompted to give feedback on the event. And I know these are sometimes a bit of a pain, but the feedback is really important for us because it's going to help make sure that we deliver future content that is useful to you. So do please take the time to sort of answer that sort of feedback. We're also going to be prompting you to see if there's any particular topics that are of a challenge or of a concern that we think we can help you with. So without sort of any further delay, I'm going to hand over to David. David, if you're happy to give us your views and BCIS's views on the economy and the tender climate, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, James. As James alluded to, this is sort of unparalleled times. I've been in the industry longer than I care to remember. I really can't recall anything quite as amazing as we've been going through over the last few years. In fact, I'm not sure we actually really recovered from the financial crash of 2008. So, yeah, it's been an interesting 15 years or so. Also touching on what James said, we are trialing a new platform, and this is very much a live presentation. So hopefully, fingers crossed, everything works out fine. But please bear with us if there are a few technology issues. I've got a brief presentation, probably about 15 slides. And in those slides, we're basically going to have a quick look at the outlook for construction, using both historical data and some of our predictions. To come up with those, we use a combination of the latest available official statistics and then combine them with BCIS data to inform our view of the outlook for our sector. So we'll start by looking at the prospects for the whole economy to try and set some context, and then look at the impacts of those recent events on the construction sector. So setting the scene, I mean, I think, following, people seem to be surprised by what's currently going on, but following the shocks of Brexit, COVID, and then the war in Ukraine over the last few years, I think it was always fairly likely that it was going to be a difficult period to overcome. I guess the question that we're going to try and answer today is, how long will those crises last, or the impacts from those crises? And I guess that's the sort of the crux of this presentation. So if we look at the wider context, so obviously construction sits within the wider economy. Overall, GDP declined by over 20% through 2020, as you can see on this chart. And although the recovery was sort of equally as dramatic, GDP is still below pre-pandemic levels. So not surprising that construction is struggling within that context. Recent forecasts from the Bank of England suggest that we're heading to a recessionary environment. And despite the sort of above trend growth in 2022 of about 4.3%, the wider economy, according to the bank, is going to shrink by 1.5% next year, and then by a further 1% in 2024, and then recovering, but only minimally, in 2025, with some positive growth. So we're in an environment where the economy is probably heading, if not already, in a recession. Now, if we quickly look at consumer price inflation, this has been running at the highest rate for decades, probably since the 1970s. And the title of this webinar was, How bad can inflation get? Well, the good news, and this is heavily caveated, maybe the worst is nearly over. We may well have reached the peak, and in fact, some commentators suggest that we may have passed the peak of inflation, and this is whole economy inflation. Although I think rates are likely to remain high for some months, but the Bank of England is now forecasting consumer price inflation to fall sharply from mid-23, almost halving from today's levels, and by 2024 returning to long-term trend. Unusually, I think, for us, and this is there's lots of debates about interest rate rises and how do you control inflation that we're currently experiencing. I think this time around, inflation is largely being driven by cost push pressures and not demand pull pressures. And so it's a fairly careful balancing act, because any impact on future demand levels from hiking interest rates could have a significant impact on the cost of borrowing, and obviously reduce investment levels further. And this will likely feed into increased recessionary pressures, and could end up with a stagnant economy. So in summary, we have, in the wider economy, we have prospects of relatively high inflation, although declining from the peaks, combined with negative growth. So not a great environment for construction. If we quickly turn to look at construction now, and we'll start by looking at construction output. This chart shows total work, which is the grey line at the top, and then the main sectors of construction, so new work and repair and maintenance. And we've got a long trend here from 97 to 2022, so 25 years of output. And I think you can clearly see that the impact of the pandemic and subsequent issues has really hit output. I mean, if you look at total output, it's only just reached pre-pandemic levels, and that was largely driven by growth in repair and maintenance, which is the green line at the bottom of the chart. New work, which is probably 2/3 of total output, is still below 2019 levels, and the decline in new work is likely to be because of declining investment. It's much more volatile than repair and maintenance. So obviously recently there was the autumn statement following 5 or 6 weeks of consternation politically. And following that autumn statement, BCIS produced near-term growth predictions for the sectors that we're concerned with in construction. And this slide provides our sort of near-term predictions for the next 1 to 2 years for sector output. Broadly speaking, our expectations are that most our repair and maintenance sectors will continue to grow. But the sectors that are reliant on investment, which is essentially most new work sectors, they're likely to decline. And the sectors reliant on public spending are probably going to stagnate, given limits to public spending and government borrowing. So that's our sort of near-term predictions for growth in our sector. If we look at sort of longer-term forecasts for new construction, which is, as I say, by far the biggest sector, it's doubled the size of the repair and maintenance sector. And on this slide, we're essentially looking at the subsectors of construction, so public housing, private housing infrastructure, public non-housing, private industrial, and the private commercial sectors. To To the left of the red line is our forecasts, and sorry, to the right of the red line are our forecasts. To the left of the red line are our actuals. And it's evident from the chart that some growth is predicted over the forecast period. But most sectors are either stagnant or declining from their previous peaks. Commercial work, which is the biggest subsector of construction, certainly was, the green line, has seen the largest decline in output over the period, and we predict that the growth will be minimal through 2027, as the requirements for both retail and office space have changed fundamentally over the last 5 years. In terms of positive news, infrastructure output, which is the red line, has grown over the entire period, and we forecast that growth will continue through to the end of the forecast period in 2027. But we suspect that the sector, certainly infrastructure spending, may be used as a stimulant to try and to boost the wider economy, which is pretty sort of standard in Keynesian economics for boosting economic growth. Also of note on there is the slowdown in private housing, which is the blue line. We do expect that over the next couple of years there will be a slowdown, but following that, we think the sector will rebound quite strongly through to the end of 2027, but notably still below pre-crisis levels. So moving on from output to probably the thing that you're most interested in terms of BCIS's forecasts, is the growth in BCIS material and labour cost indices, and we'll take a look at these and also our general cost and tender price indices in the next slides. I mean, it's staggering to see material cost increases running at the highest level for over 20 years, and probably, actually, if you take this series back, it's probably even significantly longer than that. And those cost increases in materials have far outstripped labour cost increases, peaking at almost 25% growth. Although our forecasts suggest that they're likely to rapidly decline over the next year and return to trend through 2024 onwards. So that's a positive, again highlighting that we may have either reached the peak, inflationary peak, or are currently passing through it. On the flip side of that, labour cost increases, and it's worth mentioning that these are measured as agreed wage awards, are likely to persist for slightly longer in our forecast, but again returning to trend in 2025. So a fairly positive picture. So now if we move on to growth in the BCIS General Building Cost Index and the BCIS Tender Pricing Index, we can examine the impacts on input costs and tender prices. And again, right of the red line is our most recent forecasts, which have just been prepared, and to the left are actual conditions. So as you'd expect, given the current supply conditions, costs and prices have both increased rapidly from the mid 2020s, with prices lagging costs slightly. But we are now beginning to see some decline in both costs and prices, and our predictions are that they will continue to fall as the supply position improves and recessionary pressures start to build. So going forward, tender prices are, broadly speaking, expected to track costs, if at slightly reduced levels. But we are forecasting that they will both return to trend late next year, early 2024. So again, another fairly positive picture. Both this chart and the previous chart suggest that we are past the inflationary peak. Conscious that I've been bombarding you with slides with charts, so quickly move on to something slightly more text-based. I think a caveat with all data and data analysis and forecasting at the moment is the timeliness of the data that we use to inform our forecast can be 2 or 3 months back in history. So there's always a problem with reporting statistics because of the lag in data collection and production. And that is compounded in fast-moving situations, which we've probably been in over the last few years. And the other issue to consider is that forecasting generally, and this is not just BCIS, but general forecasting always works best in steady state conditions. And unfortunately, what we've been in over the last few years is anything but a steady state. So to overcome some of those problems with the data lag, BCIS have established a panel of expert industry practitioners, and we use that panel to supplement our understanding of sector performance, just to confirm our forecast outputs and provide us with some anecdotal evidence of what's happening on the ground. And we had a meeting earlier this week of the panel, and the highlights from that meeting are just coming up in the next couple of slides, but they generally suggest that the heat's starting to come out of the market, and tendering conditions are starting to ease compared to where they were a year ago, for instance. Again, panel reported that price increases are slowing, which tends to confirm what our forecasts were saying, that we may be past the peak of the inflationary problem. If you look at annual prices between 4Q 2021 and 4Q 2022, which is where we are now, so annually prices at commit to construction stage increased by an average of 8.6%. But if you look at the quarterly jump, which is from 3Q last quarter to this quarter, 4Q 2022, prices at the same commit to construct stage have only increased by an average of 1.2%. So it clearly points to a slowing of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing in construction. However, there are still inputs where we are continuing to see some inflationary pricing. Largely speaking, the high energy use materials and components, so steel, concrete, plasterboard, insulation, but also some specialist labour areas are quite inflationary, and I think that's largely due to supply issues, probably exacerbated by Brexit. Moving on to supply and logistics, which obviously have become a real hot topic over the last few years. Our panel now suggests that logistics challenges are mostly resolved. There are still some supply issues, but they're not as significant as they have been. Transit and storage of materials is being booked in earlier. Contractors are using holding areas to guarantee that those materials will reach site when they're needed. Those consolidation centres do add to project costs, but the cost of transport is increasing. But obviously, it's allowing them to be set up for materials on site when needed. So, again, touched on just a minute ago that any material or component which is energy intensive in production is likely to still be seeing inflationary pressures, and they'll probably remain until the energy crisis is abated. Long lead time goods are still a particular issue. Some affected by delays and price hikes during those delays. So contractors are hoping for a relaxation on delay clauses aligned to material availability. So in terms of supply and logistics, a fairly positive picture, and I think that's one of the things that construction can be congratulated on, that they have, the sector as a whole has managed to weather the storms of the last 2 or 3 years, and has remained operational despite the issues. In terms of the tendering climate, our panel suggests that the appetite to tender has increased recently with a softening of the market and the likely, or at least predicted, imminent downturn. Contractors are already starting to see a slowdown in some sectors, in particular the private sector. So they're less inclined to turn work down and more likely to tender for opportunities. In terms of general feedback from contractors, their order books are pretty full for next year, and the focus has now moved on to 2024 and 25. There is interest in the right types of projects from contractors, but there is still a fairly high level of nervousness about the inflationary pressures and also supply chain insolvencies, which are currently increasing. In terms of procurement, obviously, with long programs of work, so we're talking 2 or 3 or maybe longer year projects, the risk of inflation is likely to be quite high for the tenderers. So they're looking to limit their risks or include large provisional amounts to cover the risk, which obviously impacts on tender levels. So there could be a pressure on tender prices going forward. In terms of procurement routes, there are sort of slightly higher levels of inflation being pushed through on projects with target-based procurement models. But on the flip side of that, there are more and more carve-outs of some inflationary components, so particularly like steel, for instance, and the price is then subject to later adjustment. This obviously reduces the level of inflation at the point of the tender, but will still impact the outturn price for the client. So that's our view from our industry panel, and I think over the last few years that's been operating. That's been a very, very useful addition to our forecasting process. If we now go back to some charts briefly, we produce something called a market conditions index, and this allows us to sort of look at what the future conditions might be in the market. It's a market factor essentially, which is the relationship between costs and prices, and we use that as a predictor of what future demand conditions look like. So a quick summary: when the MCF, the market conditions factor, is rising, then prices are rising faster than costs. When the MCF is falling, costs are rising faster than prices. So at the moment, costs are currently rising faster than prices, which is what we'd expect. So our MCF has been trending downwards since mid-2020 as the impacts of the various crises, but particularly the pandemic, started to be felt. Going forward, our forecast suggests relatively benign market conditions. And this is probably largely due to the impact of the downturn, or the expected downturn, beginning to influence our sector. And I think one takeaway from this is that our market conditions factor suggests that the impact of the latest crises, and there are more than one, have been less severe than that seen after the financial crash of the late 2000s. So I think that is fairly encouraging news. So what are our predictions in summary for the future, given what we now know. I think despite construction having weathered the economic headwinds over the last few years quite well, one thing to take away from what we've just seen is that new work output is still below the pre-pandemic levels. And I guess the question is, how long will it take for growth to return and for new work output to exceed pre-crisis levels? I think going forward, levels of investment are likely to remain constrained given the economic conditions that we're going to be experiencing. And recent forecasts, particularly our forecast, suggest that new work output won't return to the previous peak until the end of 2027. So that's 8 years of no real growth in the sector. And this is a term that's been bandied about quite a lot by economists at the moment, is stagflation, which is a very real possibility in not only in our sector, but also across the wider economy. And for more on this, look at what happened to Japan's economy in the 1990s, when essentially they had a lost decade of growth. And stagflation is essentially little or no growth, and this can be in the wider economy or construction specifically, coupled with relatively high inflation. And you end up with a very, very poor environment, not only for construction investment, but for investment generally. So that's something to watch for in our sector. Some positive news, though. It appears that supply constraints of both labour and materials are currently easing, leading to costs and prices stabilising in the longer run. So to sum up, the title of the webinar was "How Bad Can It Get for Inflation?" We think inflation may have peaked, so we could be over the worst of that. But obviously all eyes are now turning to the length and depth of the predicted recession. So the outlook for construction continues to look challenging in the immediate future. So that's a very brief run through of where I think we are in terms of our sector outlook. And now we're happy to take questions. I'll hand over to James to moderate the Q&A session. And as James said at the outset, please feel free to ask questions now live, or we can pick things up after the event.
Great, thank you, David. I've known you for a number of years, and that was almost positive. You know, that was quite upbeat, which has taken me a little bit by shock. Other than the term stagflation, I think, which
I had to get that.
Certainly a new one for me.
Yeah.
So great. Right, we're now going to open up to a panel. So I'm going to invite Ian Pegg, who's a solutions architect at BCIS. Welcome, Ian, and Joe Martin, lead consultant. Joe, if you can join us as well and share your video, that will be awesome. Great, thank you for joining us, Ian and Joe. So, David, the good news is that your slides have prompted quite a few questions. The bad news is, obviously, we've got about 10 minutes to get through as many as we can. So I won't mention sort of people's names as I sort of call out some of the questions, but somebody has obviously noted that when we're looking at labour cost inflation, it's based on nationally agreed wage awards. Do we have any sense of what's happening on sites? Was sort of the first question. I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up. Joe, yeah, great.
Yes. Yes, we have an index which is based on data we get from Hayes, the construction recruitment firm who supply a lot of labour to sites. It's in BCIS in the resources index section, and that suggests that site rates have been rising very much in line with inflation. I think the third quarter figure was just over 12% on the year, which is very much in line with inflation, and it's been rising steadily over the last year or so. This does give us an insight into what's happening to at the site gate as distinct to National Agreed Wage Awards. And the difference between those two get picked up in that market conditions factor. So anything between our cost indices reflect National Agreed Wage Awards and factory gate prices. Any factoring on materials and the differences between the site rates and National Agreed Wage Awards are picked up in that market conditions factor in our tender price index.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, I think it's always it's also worth pointing out that the Hays data is also much higher than the average weekly earnings series that the ONS produce. So that there is quite a disparity between the labour cost measures, and the Hays one, certainly at site level, appears to track much higher than the others.
Great. Okay, thank you. We've had quite a few sort of questions connected to mitigating risk of inflation, which is quite a broad topic in itself. But I just wondered if the panel could give the listeners a sense of, are we aware of things that are going on? Fluctuation price clauses has obviously been mentioned in a few questions here as well. Are they coming back? Is this sort of a theme that's going on? So I just wondered if we're picking up any things that are happening within the industry that's helping sort of mitigate those high inflation rates.
Should I have a go at that one again, James? That's all right.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, open forum, Joe. Yeah, please.
Yeah, we're seeing two things. One is the industry, the contractors themselves are making efforts to pre-order materials to get subcontractors' prices fixed during the tender stage. And in many cases, clients are facilitating this by being prepared to pay for materials up front. So these are mitigating the effect within the tendering process. We have seen a huge increase in queries about contracts. I don't have any numbers to how many contracts have fluctuating clauses. We've certainly seen people introduce clauses for specific areas, so people have put steelwork as a but both the NEC and the JCT clauses for full formula price fluctuation, we've had a lot of queries about those, so I would imagine that they are coming through. And in these uncertain times, I think it's a very sensible thing to consider.
Absolutely. Great. Anybody want to add any more to that? If not, we've got plenty of other questions. We'll move on. There was a couple just sort of asking for a bit of confirmation, David, in terms of the charts. Price increases are going to slow, but we're not expecting a decline in tender prices. So the confirmation that's required is we're still looking at prices and at an elevated level rather than a reduction. Which obviously we can happily confirm that is the case. Questions around sort of what margin range are we expecting? There's a lot of volatility still in the market. We did at some point produce sort of ranges, didn't we, of our forecasts? Do we have a sense of what those margins would be at the moment?
Are you talking about the contractors' margins?
I'm talking about the margins in terms of the range of the sort of inflation forecast that we've got, Joe. But yeah, I think the margins were sort of picked up in the market conditions sort of commentary earlier, weren't they? Mm-hmm. But yeah, just in terms of the range, there's a lot of volatility out there still. How are we dealing with that volatility? I think the best way of answering that is probably revisiting our forecasts on a regular basis using the latest information.
We've always tended, James, to produce a point forecast, because if you produce a range forecast, what do people do? They stick a line down the middle. So we think it's more helpful to produce a point forecast. But we certainly could, as we did during the pandemic, produce an upside and downside forecast. Just say we don't generally do that. And on the issue of tender prices continue to rise, we do think that's cost pressures. It's not contractors' margins increasing.
Yeah.
I think contractors' margins will be under pressure, certainly over the next year or so. But there will be continuing labour cost pressures, particularly.
Brilliant. Someone's asking about the sources of tender price data that we're using, and is there an attempt to expand those sources into the future? So the particular point here is the person believes that public sector works might outweigh private sector, e.g. housing, which maybe doesn't give an industry-wide picture. So what are we doing about sort of data and increasing that sort of range? Don't know if any of you wants to pick that one up.
Can I perhaps start to answer?
Yeah, thanks.
At least.
Yeah, thank you.
We've started a private housing price index, which has been running for a few years now. So that's to try and fill in that sector. Tender price index is supposed to cover across all sectors, but we do struggle to collect data in some areas. So we ought to make our usual appeal for subscribers to send in project information to keep our data flow going. Because of the complications with the pandemic, we've been relying on the TPI panel quite a lot recently. So that's another area that we've managed to keep going, and that gives us a broad picture across all the building sectors, and of course we have also got some civil engineering indices which attempt to measure prices in that sector.
James, if all 400 odd people who are in this thing would send us details of a single project, then that problem would be solved.
Well, there we go, Joe. I think that's the answer. We'll keep them all on the call until until they've committed. Yeah, the more data we can get, obviously the better. So if any of you can support data, that will only improve.
Can I just add something, sorry, James, about the private housing sector? It's very different because the house builders, so-called, are really developers who build for themselves. So our private housing price index is based on those developers sending us the cost of a standard house. And really what they're reporting is subcontractors' prices, not what they would charge if they were a contractor in the general contracting market. So it is a slightly different market. But I say that index is there. What's the inset? That index is there.
Thanks, Joe. What role will productivity play going forwards? That's a good question.
Sounds like a topic for a webinar.
It does indeed. It does indeed. Yeah, I think we'll park that one and give that some thought in terms of how we can answer it. Unless any of you have got anything off the top.
I was just going to say, productivity will come if we get move towards off-site construction, and we have had a move to off-site construction. You know, as you can tell by looking at me, I've been in the industry for a long time. The way we build buildings now, there's an awful lot of components that come in pre-manufactured, and that ought to increase. So that ought to increase productivity for building a building generally, and I think we will see that we go forward, which will increase productivity. But I don't think we can improve the productivity of another. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. I think you broke up a little bit. Hopefully that was just for me, but that's great. Look, we're almost out of time. We just need to. I don't know, Joe W, if you could submit the results of the poll for us that we asked everyone to complete. Or is that something that I can do?
Yeah, just publish that, James.
Brilliant. Can everybody view that, Joe? Do you know? Or is that
all attendees should be able to see that now?
Great. So we've published the results of the poll that we asked you to complete. Between all of the bills that are currently going through Parliament, the slight majority is around the carbon emissions bill for buildings, sort of 49%, followed by the minimum energy performance of buildings, sort of 43%, which is, I think broadly probably what we were expecting. The carbon emissions bill is one that obviously we've been monitoring quite closely within BCIS. BCIS have been leading a pan-industry consortia of professional bodies and other sort of organisations trying to develop the built environment carbon database, which is something that will be coming online around sort of April time next year. There is obviously massive sort of inconsistencies in carbon reporting and management and measurement, I should say, and BECD is going to be an important part of that jigsaw going forwards. We're also obviously from BCIS intending to link that carbon data over to cost data and life cycle costing data to allow our users to be able to consider the impacts of all three of those things on specification sort of choices. So subject to the feedback we get from you, I imagine carbon is at least probably one webinar in itself. Yeah, interesting to see that, if we mandate carbon emissions on buildings, that's going to be quite a step change in terms of the work that professionals will have to do sort of going forwards. Don't know if the panel had any further observations on the poll before we sort of run to a close. No. No. Well, we know the technology works in terms of the poll now,
Yeah,
which is great. So for the next webinar, we can start to think about what kind of questions that we're going to ask. So just to wrap up, obviously want to thank David and the panel for their contributions today. Very much appreciated. I think it was a lot of insight to try and get through in a short space of time. We still have a lot of questions that we have not even attempted to answer. So as I said at the beginning of this session, we'll be taking those questions and answering those on the BCIS LinkedIn group. So please do get further engaged with the BCIS sort of LinkedIn group. Ask more questions if you need to. There's been a number of questions about us sharing the slides. Which Rich McLean, I don't know if you can just confirm verbally for me what we're doing. We're obviously going to be sharing this video of the recording of the webinar. Are the slides going to be sent round? Is there anything we're doing there?
Yes. I've responded to a couple of people, but yeah, we can circulate the slides in a PDF format afterwards.
That's great. Okay, excellent stuff. So in which case, just want to thank everybody for joining us today on our webinar. Very much look forward to sort of engaging further with you and hearing about your feedback on today's session and ideas for future sessions that you think would add value. So please do take the time out to complete that feedback form once it comes over to you. So very best wishes to you all. Thank you for joining today, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.